Greetings and welcome to Fluid Conversations, a platform where global and local thought leaders from the water sector gather to reflect on the status of the global and local environment. The topics that are covered on Fluid Conversations span economics all the way through to the natural environment. Your host for Fluid Conversations is Mr. Dhesigen Naidoo, who is the CEO of the Water Research Commission. He's president of Human Rights to Water. He's also a fellow at the Mapungubwe Institute of Strategic Reflection, as well as a founding member of the Water Policy Group. Dhesigen is passionate about innovation, and he's an activist for social change. Over to you, Dhesigen.
Kosi, thank you very much, and hello to everyone. And today, we come to you from two destinations. I am in South Africa, and my guest today is somebody who is all the way from India and joining us from New Delhi today. She needs little introduction, but let me give it a go anyway. She is a political activist. She is a renowned environmentalist. She is the strongest advocate for sustainable development, and I would suggest with more of a bias on the environmental side of sustainable development, but we're going to explore that as well. She's multi-award winning with the Padma Shri, the Stockholm Water Prize, and most recently the Edinburgh Medal, among others. In 2016, she was called in by Time magazine on their list of the 100 most influential people in that year, and I think we can agree for many years afterwards. I am, of course, talking about the Director General of the Center for Science and Environment in India, the editor of Down to Earth, celebrated author, and another advocate defining the new global conscience, Dr. Sunita Narain. Sunita, good morning and good afternoon to you.
Thank you, Desi, and I'm so happy to be with you. I'm really happy, Des, to do this with you. I think it's a privilege. Thank you, Des.
Well, thank you. And let me kick off. I mean, the place that we're at is the unmistakable place that we have to start, and that's around COVID. We are in the grips of this epidemic. We have been in the grips of this epidemic for all of 2020. We are in it now. We are probably going to be in it for the next year or so, or maybe even more, depending on how things progress. But among the many vistas that have been given to us by this COVID virus is that we have seen the very depths of the downside, of course, with the health crisis everywhere in the world now, with the economic crisis that has followed closely on that, the psychological and the social crisis in the world. And this cache of negative impact is huge and intense. But alongside that, COVID gave us glimpses of a potential interesting future. For the first time in a long time, you've had clean air in Delhi. People in Beijing have had the same. We've had all sorts of wildlife roaming into the now deserted urban environment. So is this a marking point for something that is completely different? Are we looking at the possibility of this pause point becoming the start of a new developmental model for all of us?
That's a very good question, Des. And the fact is that the world is at a crossroad. I mean, if you think about it, there has not been, our generation, I don't think we have seen something as disruptive as what we have seen in COVID. I mean, I know when I speak to you, I speak at a time when you and South Africa, of course, have seen momentous change. I mean, your generation in South Africa has seen momentous change. My generation in India did not see it. Our independence and the partition and all the horrors that unfolded was something that I have not seen. But when I think about COVID and you think about the disruption that we have seen, it should shock us. It should teach us that this really is not something that we want for the future. And it does provide us a lot of lessons, as you very rightly have said. I mean, the first big lesson of COVID was that it actually amplifies the inequities in our world. If you look at my own country, India, and you look at South Africa, in our realities, we know, and for all of us so passionate about water, we know that the lack of water is a key determinant of health. And it is COVID that has brought us that realization even more sharply. It has told us what it is like when people live in bad housing conditions, when they do not have access to sanitation, how more vulnerable they are to disease. And it also tells us that the world is one, that if the poor in India remain vulnerable to the disease, and the rich in India can never be safe. And that really was something that we learned when it came to, you talked about the clean air in Delhi, the blue skies in Delhi. Yes, we got blue skies, we got clear, we could hear the sound of birds, which we'd just forgotten for so long. But the fact is, it came at such a huge cost. And it was the poor in my country who have been most vulnerable because of COVID. They are the ones who've lost their livelihoods. They are the ones who were at double jeopardy. One hand, more vulnerable to the virus. On the other hand, they are the ones who lost their livelihoods. And even today, they are the ones who are faced with such huge destitution. So I don't think that's the way we're going to get clean air. So I think what COVID has told us is, yes, there is an option for us to do things differently. But for that, we must recognize the lessons that COVID has taught us, that this past way, the very dystopian relationship with nature, the inequities in our world, the marginalization of the very poor in our world is not the way to go. And that's really what should also make us reflect when you see the dog-eat-dog world of the global governance, where today's vaccine has become another way of creating more inequities in the world.
In many ways, the thing that had the promise to take us to a better place, or at least a different place, is being used by the powers that be to reinforce the current control systems that were there. In fact, the ones that have actually been weakened in the last 10 years or so. And we're seeing something of a revival of that. But we can't ignore this momentous point in time, because we were in January 2021.
Yes.
This is the first year of the third decade of the third millennium. This is really, really significant. And we look at this point as a reflection point on the agreements that we had made, on the aspirations that we had expressed around the Sustainable Development Agenda. We are at a point, I think, where there is a general collective agreement that the patterns of the development model that we've been using, which is largely fossil fuel based, is one, very limited. Two, it has huge impact, not only on the environment, but also on human health. So can it be that 2021 will be that year when we really launch into the primary concept of the green economy?
I think that's really where we are. I mean, if I think about it, that's the critical question today. I mean, there are two paths that we could take. One is that governments could go scrambling back to building the old economy once again, because we are in such deep trouble that we basically want to dig up more coal, we want to pollute more, we want to, build our economies inward, saying, we are going to be, we're looking at energy security from the point of view of dirty coal. And we want to do development in the old way, which actually was the only way that we know. Or it's a time when governments will sit back and say, no, here is a new time. This is a time for recovery. And instead of recovering in the same old way that we knew, we can do things differently. And I think that's the opportunity there is. I mean, if you think of India, and I maybe there is some resonance with this in South Africa, but if I think of India, with COVID, what we had was this amazing exodus of our workers from our cities. Huge numbers of people went back home because the cities turned their backs on them. And for once, the invisible worker of our city became visible to most of us. They were heart-rendering pictures that we all saw. And I think for all of us Indians, it was a time of, COVID didn't bring us so much grief as those images of the poor leaving our cities did. But now there is an opportunity. There are large numbers of people who've gone back home. They're in their villages. And today, we have an option of reinvesting in village economies, making them more resilient, making them more green, making them more waterproof, more climate change proof, so that you can actually build an economic future in rural India. You can reinvest in agriculture, not just in high productivity agriculture, high input, high productivity agriculture, which makes farmers more in debt and sort of creates its own problems, but in a new model of agriculture, which is really based on well-being, based on investing in the soil, in the water systems, and building that resilience in rural India. And on the other hand, when you're thinking of the workers coming back, and this is happening in India, and this I think has been quite a momentous change, that now when the workers are coming back, the labor is getting much more prized and much more valued. So the government of India is talking about affordable housing systems so that people have housing in our cities. There's livability in our cities for workers, and employers are talking about how they can actually pay more, create more dignity of labor. Now, this means that the cost of consumption will go up. And this, to me, is going to be the big deciding factor for the change, for the future, because as the cost of production goes up, consumption comes down. And most of our industries, South Africa, India, we're competing with the lowest common denominator. And we're always looking to discount the cost of environment, the cost of labor, because that's the only way we can remain competitive in the world. So our cities are competing with our villages, with our peri-urban areas, and that's really where the big scramble is. And I think that's the opportunity for the whole world to come together and say, let's reinvent growth. Let's rethink about growth so that we can actually pay the cost of consumption and that we do not end up with discounting environment and labor. And this really becomes the big global question, because we cannot do it in our own countries. If China continues to flood the whole world with cheap products, then Indian industry turns around and says, well, we want to use all the dirtiest coal possible because we want to be able to compete. And that's the scramble to hell. And I think that's really where we need this global discussion to happen. And I hope we'll get the leadership that will do this.
Let me pick up a few things about what you said. I mean, first is this issue that, to paraphrase what you're saying, reverses the migration that we have become accustomed to, where people are actually going back to the villages or going to a different place. In the South African environment and the other African environments, we've been talking not only about the revival of rural development, but also about the concept of Ikasi development in the townships, because we have in our systems dormitory townships still in 2021, and around actually making them new economic centers. Now, I want to combine this with something else. And that something else is that in 2021, we are a short time. We are now 9 years away from 2030 and the SDG goals. So all of the primary indicators that you've been talking about around health security and food security and security of water and security of energy and so forth are the primary toolbox of these SDGs. Now, in this time that we got moving towards the SDGs, combined with the critique that you're offering on the current development model, what needs to be different? What is that wish list to organize for these 9 years to make a substantive dent towards getting to the SDGs? I mean, your recent piece around the farmers and the farmer protest in India, which has been going on for a long, long time now, was quite thought-provoking, because you're talking about reintroducing a new narrative around subsidies, for example. Would you like to expand on that? Are we going to get closer in these 9 years?
It's a tough question, but I hope so. And I hope that COVID will push us to think a little bit out of the box, will push our leadership across the world to think differently. I mean, if you look at agriculture, and I wrote about this, and most of you would have read and heard about the farmer protests in India. And essentially, it's portrayed more as sort of farmers want this subsidy, and see, Indian farmers, a group of farmers are sort of, want this subsidy, and it's wrong. But the fact of the matter is, and I think we need to talk about this far more openly, and somewhere this narrative and this whole discussion has got lost, is how much farming is subsidized across the world. And that in the rich world, farming is obscenely subsidized. And then, it's just that the subsidy word has changed from a blue box to a green box to a brown box to a yellow box. And, you keep juggling it around and calling it with different names. But the fact is, you have recognized the fact that you need to invest public funding into the health of land, health of water, and that is the only way you can secure the livelihood of farmers. Now, if you look at India, and the OECD data makes that clear, in fact, Indian farmers subsidize consumers. It's the reverse. It's a minus 5% as against Norway, which is close to 70% of the production cost being government subsidy. So, I mean, the sheer inequity of, and this is true for Africa. And I think this is something that needs much more open discussion. We talk about SDGs in such a banal way now, and we do not talk about the politics of trade anymore. I mean, I have grown up with the politics of trade being on the top of the development agenda. And yet we have somehow managed to change the narrative, and that this politics of trade, of who has benefited and who continues to benefit, is lost. So we cannot talk about the resilience of Indian farmers unless we talk about the fact that Indian farmers and South African farmers, and I'm talking about poor South African farmers, are going to require public investment in the cost of growing food. Because we also have another part of the challenge, that we have poor consumers. So if you don't have affordable food, you end up with your consumers not getting food at costs that they can afford. And that's where governments in our world then end up importing the food, which is subsidized, and our farmers lose both ends. So I think that's the narrative that needs to come back. That's the discussion that I think we now need to have in UN, WTO, in all these forums where our governments are today fighting with their backs against the wall. I mean, the Indian government is being accused of subsidizing its farmers as against European and American governments saying, you need to stop food subsidy. And on the other hand, we talk glibly about development assistance and about SDGs and about meeting climate goals. I mean, shouldn't we see the irony in this? Shouldn't we see the hypocrisy in this? Shouldn't all of us as part of civil society be calling their bluff and be talking about this more openly? We cannot be genteel about these things anymore and bury our heads in the sand.
And the resonance with this part of the world, Sunita, you will know that agricultural development is one of the mainstay strategies around the development of this continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And the uniqueness in the South African context is the restitution of land project to reverse what has happened during apartheid. And what we have is a very, very small contingent of emerging farmers that are actually managing to succeed through this restitution, precisely because all of the state aid toolboxes that were there to help the white farmers before no longer exist now. So the thing that you're describing between India and Europe, for example, both exists in the South African environment, but over a different time. And this point has been made repeatedly. But the other issue that comes along with this is around the availability of the resources to enable any kind of development. And core to that is the issue of water. And one of the things that we have looked upon with great admiration to the CSE and yourself is that you have taken some very complex concepts that we drown in beautiful scientific literature to have very polite discussions into the raw and basic out into the real world so that people can grapple with the issues. How critical is this going forward?
Oh, you and I are very similar on that. Our passion is water, and our passion is, to ensure that water is available to every single person in the world. And I think we are still struggling, and we need to understand that we are struggling because we still don't have the right template. We still don't have the right approach on how we will get water to everybody. We still think very technocratically. We haven't looked at the politics of water, and that's really what you and what CSE has been talking about, is that, where you need communities to have control over their own water futures. You need people to have rights to be able to harvest the water, to be able to manage the water, to be able to build their water systems. And you need the state to enable that. And, India has an incredible program, and that's something I'm very proud of. And I think, is the Manrega. It's called the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Program. It's an incredibly powerful idea where you're using the labor of people into building ecological assets. And that entire program came out of the drought and the famine of the 70s, when you were essentially seeing large exodus of rural people into urban India because, and this was in Maharashtra, because of the drought and the famine. And you created a very simple idea saying, the urban Mumbai, or people from Bombay or Mumbai would actually pay a professional tax. And that tax would go into creating an employment guarantee scheme. Everybody would be guaranteed the right to work. And over time, that scheme has become a government scheme, and you today have a massive investment in building rural ecological assets. And I think what we are learning is that even now, however, unless you get community control over those assets, unless communities have a greater ownership over the assets, you will not get the pond to get water every year. And because of the extremely complicated systems that we have of governance, we are not getting our water, systems right, because we're looking at it more from infrastructure rather than looking at it from how to build societal assets and ownership. But I think it's a powerful idea. I think these are things that we need to learn from, and we need to see where things are working, because these are ideas for our future. And, in urban India and urban South Africa, you and I know that our cities are becoming huge water guzzlers, and we need to have systems in which our cities become much more water wise. But to become water wise, we also have to start managing our waste better, because one of the other big tragedies we have in the world is that not only are we getting water insecure because we are not capturing enough water and holding enough water, but we are also water insecure because the available water is getting more and more polluted. And it's getting polluted because we do not have an affordable sanitation system in which everybody has a toilet, but the disposal of excreta is also affordable and sustainable. And I think those are the learnings that we have in India, which we have in South Africa, which I think are very important for us to be able to practice, but with courage. Because one of the biggest problems that we are finding is that these are unique learnings from our part of the world. And they haven't got a stamp of approval from the engineering white male world. And so we are all very diffident about them. We are still not willing to practice them at the scale that is needed, because we need their stamp. We need them to say, yes, this has been practiced in our world, but it'll never be practiced in their world at the scale that we need it. These are our learnings, our unique challenges, and our unique contributions to a much more sustainable, water secure world. So I think we need to be able to take the leadership here. This is where the South needs to take leadership and have the boldness and the courage to be able to say, yes, we have a different paradigm of managing our water and our waste.
I just want to add to that with a reflection of something that happened on World Toilet Day in South Africa, where ourselves, together with one of our big international partners, the Gates folk, installed a new toilet system in a township school in South Africa. Very smart system, really smart technology that's sustainable and so forth. But the thing I wanted to get to is the reflection of the principal of that school on what the toilet meant. And we expected her to talk about, well, the hygiene factors associated with the school and the safety associated with that, etc. But she went way beyond that. She said, point number one is that this brings dignity to the girls in my school. Point number two, this becomes a beacon in this fairly impoverished community around of what is actually possible and how your life can change with this kind of intervention. Is this not the kind of messaging that we need to be carrying just everywhere in the world right now?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. But it's actually, to put it, it's really the wicked problem. And the wicked problem is that, we've always discounted and always sort of, the last priority. Gandhi said the last person, and the last person is always the poor woman. And if you look at the question of air pollution, I mean, the worst problem is the fact that even today, most women in the world, and let's be clear about this, most women in the world today still cook their food on using biomass. Okay, and this is in spite, in my country, we have a massive program. Government of India has come out and, a good program saying we will take away the subsidy from the rich and give it to the poor so that they can grow, they can eat their food and the woman can cook her food with dignity. But it's a poverty issue. You can give away the first cylinder at a subsidy, the second cylinder has to be bought. And who cares if the woman has to collect the firewood or the cow dung and cook with it? I mean, that's the last priority. I want, livelihood secured first, education, those are the priorities of a poor rural household. Cooking energy comes last. Same thing with the toilet. It's the last thing. Yet it's such an important part of women's the dignity, the humanity that we need to talk about. And I think that's the imagery that we need to talk about is, how powerful and how important these are for the very poor, and that, we need to be able to keep those faces in our view when we are talking about the future.
Let me press you on a topic you raised before around the global patterns of consumption, the global patterns of production, and let me add to that and say the global pattern of leadership. In just over 24 hours from now, there will be a new person in the White House. It'll be the start of the Biden presidency. And it's an interesting pause point because reflecting back on maybe the last 4 years in particular, but maybe for the last decade, there has been a serious challenge to a very classical narrative on how patterns of production and consumption and leadership have operated in the world. We have had the rise of the likes of India and China and Turkey as major new producers in the world. Even countries like Nigeria and our own continent have started to come into that space. Are we looking at a change in that pattern, in spite of the fact that the big multilaterals will still operate wherever they operate and change their centers? And is it possible inside this new model to get closer to the aspiration that you're talking about, that we have a little bit more equal world, better access, particularly for poor and vulnerable? And how do we make that a sustainable model if it is possible?
I mean, that's a $1 zillion question, but let me take you back to COVID. I think that's really where we began our conversation, and that's really where this model, leadership model, needs to come back to. I mean, today we have a situation where we are looking at large numbers of vaccination across the world. There are two problems here. One is that we have a vaccination haves versus a vaccination have-nots. And we have a huge power struggle happening in the world over vaccines. But the fact is, what leadership across the world will have to understand, and I think that's where COVID is going to teach us, continue to teach us some more lessons for this year to come, is that we will not be able to be secure until the last person is vaccinated, which means that we will need to find ways of being able to get out of this very selfish world, which is creating these models of saying, you know, my people, I'm rich, I get the vaccine, and you're poor, you're wretched, you don't get the vaccines. But the fact is, it's not going to work. That's number one. Number two, if I look at it today, one of the other problems that we're having, I don't know about South Africa, but I look at the whole world, and I think South Africa and India are very much part of it. COVID has kind of given rise to a more authoritarian system of governance, where somehow you have believed that it is okay to create these very authoritarian systems because you're dealing with an emergency. And that authoritarian system of governance has also meant that there are fewer voices of dissent, fewer voices of scrutiny, fewer voices of being able to look at what's happening and speak with authority. And experts have been looked down upon and been told, oh, you know, you have no place in this because, you know, we need to get this fixed. But the fact is today we are in a situation where we have millions to vaccinate. And we know from the history of vaccination, people take the vaccine when they have belief in government or in the system or in the vaccine itself. And we will now have to build those information systems which are credible, where people will have belief that that vaccine is indeed good and safe. And we are seeing it in India, that there is enormous hesitancy right now in taking the vaccine. And people are saying, you know, it's better I stay home and I'll stay safe, but I'd rather not take the vaccine. I'm not sure about it yet. And, you know, it does again point to the fact that those open systems, I mean, at the end of the day, you have COVID today because you still don't know where it came from. I mean, Wuhan in China is still denying access to WHO scientists to go in there and find out where it has come from, the source of it. I mean, this is, you know, those systems of extremely, you know, authoritarian, dictatorial governments which have squeezed the last voice of dissent is not good for disease management. It is not good for the way we're going to build our future. So I know I've not given you a straight answer on this, Des, but to me, those are the larger issues. The rebuilding, the strengthening of democracy globally is going to be as important as anything else going forward.
No, that's a fair point. And I think it just emphasizes the issue that where we stand now, in the middle of a global epidemic, it can actually go in either direction, that we have the opportunity for a much better, more sustainable, much greener future on the one hand. We also have the opportunity of maintaining a status quo, which is something that all the stimulus packages that have been declared around the world by and large are saying. We even have the chance to retrogress, because you're right about the authoritarian systems and the command and control mechanisms used to manage the epidemic in various parts of the world, in a space where the multilateral system is already quite fragmented. So it is a decision point. So the thing it points to is that the direction that eventually emerges depends on what all of us do today and tomorrow and in the next couple of months. So what is your message to the crusaders out there who I'm sure want to see the possibility of that better future actually emanating?
The only message that you could give right now: stay safe, stay strong, and stay focused. I mean, this is the time when the world needs us more than ever before. Needs us to make sure that we do what we do. We are not, I mean, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not here. I'm not a leader. My job is simply to speak truth to power and to keep telling the story as it is. And I think the job of many of us in whatever we do is to make sure we push the envelope. This is not a time for being genteel, for being, nice. Be nice, but push the envelope.
Excellent. Colleagues, we've been in conversation with Sunita Narain. And as you can see, the narrative around the new global conscience is developing rapidly, and it's inviting all of us to become louder and louder. That is the message from Sunita. Be polite, but be loud. Make sure you're heard. Otherwise, we're not going to get to where we want to. Sunita, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.